Right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's March Nature in You lecture. My name is Jeff Ben. I'm the Education Associate at Tuleyome. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a conservation nonprofit that's based in Woodland. And our mission is to engage in advocacy and active stewardship with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in our region. And the region that we focus on is the northern inner coast range and the surrounding areas of the Western Central Valley. The northern inner coast range are the mountains that are located off to the west of Davis and Woodland. And we particularly focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. Tuleyome played a key role in leading the effort to get that national monument established, and we're leading the coalition to expand the monument by adding the Moloch Loyak area, which is a culturally and ecologically significant ridgeline that runs along the border between Lake and Colusa counties. We also do a variety of other things, including education programs such as this monthly lecture series, field trips for K-12 classes, and hikes, trail building days, and wildflower tours, which are open to the public. And you can learn more about those and sign up for those on our events page. And I'll put that in the chat for everyone. And so without further ado, I will introduce tonight's speaker. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Ross Brennan, who is the director of the UC Davis Quail Ridge Reserve. He did his BA in environmental biology at Pomona College and then went on to work as a researcher at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. He then came back to California to UC Davis, where he did his PhD in ecology, studying plant pollinator interactions in serpentine ecosystems. And little over a year and a half ago, he started as the director of the Quail Ridge Reserve, which he is going to be telling us all about in his talk tonight. And so if you have any questions during the talk, let's hang on to those, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. All right, so Dr. Brennan, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just get my presentation up and running, and then I'll do a little bit more of an introduction. Alrighty. Hopefully everyone gets to see a nice photo of sunset over Lake Berryessa and the Inner Coast Ranges. Excellent. All right. So thank you again, Jeff, for the lovely introduction. As Jeff said, I am the director at Quail Ridge Reserve, which is located on the shores of Lake Berryessa. I did my PhD at Davis, and now, rather than just studying flowers and bees, I'm in charge of managing one of these natural reserves for the University of California. And to start our introduction, I actually want to zoom out all the way to the level of the state of California. So for those of you who are familiar with them or not, we are at Quail Ridge members of a number 41, in fact, natural reserves that are owned or operated by the University of California across the state. There's a map here. Each of these numbers coincides with one of these reserves. And these 41 reserves were founded, the system was founded starting in the 1960s with the intent of conserving some of the many ecosystems that are represented in the state of California. The idea was to represent as many as possible and to conserve them and reserve them for the missions of the university, whether that be education, research, or outreach. So it's a mix of those things. The red lines here signify the 6 of those 41 reserves that fall under the administration of UC Davis. So I'm an employee of UC Davis, and I manage number 12 on this map. right here in the center of the red. So that's Quail Ridge Reserve. And we're located quite close to the Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve, if you're familiar with that, if you've ever gone for a hike there. Or we're also right on the shores of Lake Berryessa, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But so as you can see, we have sort of this very multi-pronged mission. On the one hand, we try to support graduate students who are learning to be environmental scientists, but we're also open to the liberal arts more broadly and any other sort of science. It varies a lot by what reserve you're at, what the sort of focus of research that happens is there. We are associated with a lot of sort of collaborative projects that study environmental science and other things across the state and across the globe. And we have a lot of users and we protect a lot of biodiversity. Quail Ridge is actually one of the ones that's less unique, but very representative of a lot of California's oak woodland ecological communities. So it's a really good representative for that, which I'll be talking about more later in my presentation. So, where is Quail Ridge Reserve? Well, the first part of that answer is we are located, oh, excuse me, west of Davis by about 30 miles, southwest of Woodland by about 35 miles, or if you're in Sacramento, we're about 45 miles west. The red pin here signifies the area of the reserve, which is actually a peninsula into Lake Berryessa. We're only about 5 minutes west of the dam if you were driving along Highway 128. That's Monticello Dam. And it encompasses about 2,500 acres of land. So that's us regionally. More specifically, Quail Ridge is this big blue peninsula that lies directly west of the area known as the Devil's Gate Wildlands. This is sort of the southernmost extent of the Berryessa Snow Mountain Wilderness, or excuse me, not wilderness, National Monument. And it's a mix of ownership, but shows like sort of a contiguous area of conservation. To the north and east of us, Audubon manages Bobcat Ranch. And then directly east of us is a mix of lands owned and managed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Bureau of Land Management, Tuleyome, the University of California, but administered under the Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve, which is open to the public, and then a variety of some private in-holdings, etc. We lie directly west of that and manage an area of approximately 2,500 acres, as I said. It is sort of classic inner coast range oak woodland. It's very steep. If you've ever gone hiking at Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve, we're just less than a couple miles away. So very much the same ecosystem. However, part of the pairing of Stebbins and Quail Ridge is that Stebbins Cold Canyon is open for public hiking, etc., whereas Quail Ridge is sort of reserved as a place where more experimental research can happen and the access can be a bit more controlled by myself and my other land managers. So a little bit of history about Quail Ridge Reserve, or before we get into the longer history, this is sort of the nuts and bolts of who owns the reserve and how it's managed. Quail Ridge Reserve is a 2,500 acre peninsula that goes out from the southern side of Lake Berryessa, and we're due east of the Berryessa Highlands, which are on the next peninsula west, and due west of Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve. There are properties in the reserve, which is shown by these blue outlines. And these properties are owned by the University of California, the Bureau of Land Management, or the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then we're surrounded by Bureau of Reclamation properties. Those are the properties that are immediately upon the shore of the lake. That's who manages Lake Berryessa. And we also have some management and easements held by the Land Trust of Napa County. Then more broadly around us, there's several private parcels shown here in red or pink, though the majority of the reserve is contiguous. So it is almost a contiguous 2,500 acre parcel of land. I, as the director, although the ownership is owned by some other agencies, I, as the director, manage all of them. So now let's go back from sort of this administrative layout of who owns the land and talk about the human history of where Quail Ridge is. Like a lot of the inner coast range in this part of the state, the Quail Ridge falls in the Patwin tribal ancestral lands. A bit south, we're sort of parallel, right? Lake Berryessa is sort of parallel to the Cape Bay Valley to the north, but in a similar orientation as a watershed, and falls within the sort of the upland, the Hill Patwin territory. Quail Ridge fell within a big Mexican land grant that was provided to the Berryessa brothers starting in 1843. And they had a successful ranching area, but the area they controlled was huge. I'm sure some of you are familiar. It was leagues upon leagues in size. So no one really knows how much they might have used Quail Ridge. But historically, before Lake Berryessa was there, it was sort of upland oak savanna. So it may not have been used as much as the valley lowlands for things like cattle grazing, but free range cattle kind of like to go wherever they go. So the guess is that it has been since 1843 some level of upland grazing, ranching, rangeland. Then after the Berryessa brothers sort of went out of business, the Monticello Valley, which is now underneath current-day Lake Berryessa, was a very prosperous agricultural valley similar to the Cape Bay Valley today. And it was full of farming and ranch land. And what we think happened at Quail Ridge was, again, it was upland cattle grazing. In 1958, Lake Berryessa was flooded, and Quail Ridge at that point became the peninsula into Lake Berryessa it is today. So probably after that, it might have continued to be a variety of private parcels, but maybe small ranching operations, etc. We know there was some level of ranching because there are some like earthen dam stock ponds on the property, but that's sort of the extent of the human history that we know for the property. Then for Quail Ridge itself, the history of the reserve sort of starts in the 1980s. A local couple from the Davis area started the Quail Ridge Wilderness Conservancy, which they decided they wanted to start purchasing these private parcels in the Quail Ridge Peninsula to conserve the important representation of the oak woodland that was there. So the beginning of Quail Ridge Reserve was sort of a mosaic of most of these blue parcels on the map being bought up by a small local nonprofit. And that happened sort of throughout the 1980s. And then from about 1989 through the 90s, Quail Ridge Reserve as a university facility was in its infancy. At that point, the reserve didn't really exist yet. It didn't really have any staff, but the local nonprofit started giving or selling those parcels to the university so that the university could manage them in perpetuity. Then from about 2000 is when Quail Ridge Reserve started getting some decent staffing and became more of a contiguous managed area with the intent of providing a space for outdoor classrooms and research facilities to researchers from the University of California and elsewhere. All right, so that's sort of the underlying natural history of the site. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more of my more familiar to me being a Northern Californian and being a scientist at heart, the natural history of the place. So one of the things that we always have to remember about natural history is it often starts with the soil and the climate, because those are what support the plants, that support the animals, etc. So here, I like to start thinking about the plants of Quail Ridge Reserve. We have a map here. And one thing that I want to be sure everyone remembers as we continue through this talk is that Quail Ridge Reserve was within the perimeter of the 2020 LNU complex wildfire. So a lot of the things I'm going to show you are historic maps of things like vegetation. And now since 2020, when the fire happened, a lot of these plant communities are recovering. Some may look like they do in this map in the future, they may not. And we're sort of in that transformational stage at this time. So to go back to what plants are here. Well, first of all, Quail Ridge falls within the inner coast ranges and pretty darn close to the eastern edge of that. We're only a few miles west of the valley floor in Winters, California, and it falls within a Mediterranean climate. We have long, hot summers and cool, wet winters, although we actually fall just on that sort of ridge line that falls between the wine country of Napa and the drier, hotter Central Valley of Winters. So a few of the things we have that are pretty cool is we have a really high diversity of oaks because of that. We have 5 species of oaks that occur on the reserve, and those produce at least 6 oak woodland different communities, in addition to the other woody plants. So you can see on the legend of our map here on the right, we have several different oak communities. Blue oaks are pretty dominant in some places, but we also get valley oaks down in the canyon bottoms where it's more similar to maybe the climate of the Central Valley riparian areas. We get black oaks. I'm someone from the foothills of the Sierras, so I was a little surprised to see them in some places hot and as dry as Quail Ridge, but they're there. We have some scrub oaks. We have the interior live oak. And then we have oh man, okay. Blue, black, live, scrub, valley. Perfect. All right, that's the 5. Then, and most of those oak woodlands, they sort of vary based upon the aspect, which way the hillside is facing, in where those different oak species occur. A lot of our southern facing hillsides were historically covered in some sort of a chaparral scrub community. Historically, a lot of that was chamise, a classic California shrub plant that sort of dominates chaparral across the state, especially in the coastal mountain ranges. And Tuleyome, if you're familiar with Tuleyome, it's a very important food source, especially for birds in the winter. It grows very bright red berries. Those are some of our dominant species, along with some ceanothus. And then within some of those oak woodlands, there were sort of the grassland savannas you would think of like old California ranch woodlands of fescues and needlegrass. And here I'm focusing more on the native plants, but of course, like so much of California's oak woodland, we have a huge amount of various Eurasian grasses and other invasive plants that have intermixed with the native grasses and wildflower community. And as I said, the big qualifier, all of these plant communities now are somewhat different, at least, due to the 2020 LNU complex wildfire. And I'll talk a little bit more about the wildfire recovery and how it's impacting and making opportunities for research as we go forward. So here is a picture of sort of the fire history of Quail Ridge Reserve. This is to give you an idea of when fires happened around Quail Ridge Reserve prior to 2020. So as you can see, there were a bunch of fires between the 60s and 2020, but Quail Ridge itself actually didn't burn all that much. It had little spot fires, but the big ones sort of missed the peninsula. That all changed in August of 2020. All 2,500 acres of the reserve did burn in the fire. However, the intensity of that burn was pretty variable. So I'm going to show you some of the photos of late August 2020, right after the fire happened, And you'll get to see sort of what it looked like when there were moonscapes and some other places that did better. And then sort of going forward, I'll show you a lot of the plants and the animals that have survived the fire and are clearly repopulating and using all of that landscape that burned. So here, as I said, late August 2020, some places burned all the way to the soil. Here you can see sort of spectacular. These were probably a mix of oak woodland and chamise chaparral. And man, did they burn a lot. There was, sticks left. However, in comparison, there were some places that were more refuges, right? A lot of these north-facing, more moist, cooler, adapted woodlands, you can see there's green that survived. So a lot of even the overstory survived. Maybe the plants on the ground burned up, but the oaks and the bay laurels and those bigger trees largely survived. So now we have a pretty cool mosaic of plant communities that are intact over the top, at least, with things growing back in on the ground, versus areas that are sort of recolonizing and repopulating from rocks and dirt up. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty cool sort of natural laboratory to think about how a lot of California's coastal hills recover from what are frequent and might be becoming more frequent wildfires. Here, this is only a year after the fire. You can see we had some fire following lupins that clearly were very happy about all of that real estate that opened up and grew and flowered in great profusion. Here, this is from this last spring. We have lots and lots of this bindweed, which is related to morning glories. That's this white trumpet-shaped flower. This thing grew in vines on every possible thing that was standing off the ground last year. And then we have a whole variety, a profusion of all these happy native wildflowers that are finding their way in this post-fire landscape. And, this is going to keep changing, we expect, but it's pretty cool to see that, considering what a moonscape it was, that we got plenty of plants around. So now moving on from our plants, let's talk a little bit about some of the other big groups of animals that live at Quail Ridge Reserve, sort of give you hopefully more of a picture of the place. So one of the things is arthropods are pretty hard to try to get a full species list of. They're very diverse. So this includes things like spiders, mites, insects, and, it takes a ton of labor to try to collect all of these things. And you might not even collect most of them. So all we have is our best guess. There's probably, if we were to include everybody, a few thousand species of arthropods, generally all those bugs and crawlies that you would think of. But some of the taxonomic groups that we find people wanting to study more often include native bees in particular. We're not down in the valley, so there are not a lot of honeybees, which a lot of us think of as being beneficial for crop pollination. But we also, in the state of California, have over 2,000 species of native bees. These are bees that are not imported from Europe. They evolved locally, and they often have very specialized relationships with a lot of our native plants. So that's one taxonomic group of interest that a lot of people like to study. And also spiders and arachnids. So we have a long-term study going on learning about trapdoor spiders. I didn't know this, but trapdoor spiders can live as long as 15 or 20 years in the same house that they make when they're a little baby. And as you can see, woodland scorpions, which are common through a lot of the hills of California, we also find with some regularity here at Quail Ridge on the lower left. And here in the right-hand side, if you see all these weird, they look like little tunnels or turrets coming off of the ground. These are actually the nesting structures of a native bee that was present in huge numbers last spring that is specialized, and it only visits that bindweed, that trumpet-shaped white flower in the previous slide. So its scientific name is Diadasia bituberculata. You don't need to remember that, but it's a native bee and it's specialized on those flowers. And I took a film here because each of these nests, each of those holes is a nest where a single mother bee lays 10 to 20 different eggs and raises her own little family of baby bees. But one of the thoughts that we have is these baby bees are not safe because there's a parasitic fly that likes to hang around and throw its eggs like a cuckoo bird down into the nests of each of these mama bees. And then its cuckoo bird baby fly will eat the food that the bee mama is trying to provide to her babies. So I was lucky enough to get a slow motion video, which I hope is going to work here, for you guys to see. This is way slowed down. When you walk up to this, it's like 10,000 bees moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying to all go down into each of their nests. But the thought is that all of these turrets that you have, if you notice, a lot of them don't stand vertically, they sort of hang over to the side. The thought is that this is actually the way the mama bees prevent those flies from throwing their eggs down into their nests. Pretty cool. All right, so there's the video. As you can see, it's sort of slowed down. This is slow motion, but all of those insects, they're not workers in a colony. They're not each reporting to a queen bee. Each of those bees is its own mother going to its own nest to raise its own babies. So it's a totally different lifestyle, more common in the animal world than the colony lifestyle we think of when we think of honeybees. So let's see if we can see that again. I know it's a short video, but everybody can see that, yeah? So pretty cool. Even just the flight of them in the slow motion is amazing. So yeah, that was one thing that was pretty cool to learn. And interestingly, they really like disturbed ground. So where did they decide to nest? Immediately in all of the little dirt ranch roads we have for researchers to go out and use the reserve for research. So I had to run around and, put up flags everywhere to say, oh, don't drive on this part of the road. We're trying to let the bees do their nesting thing. But it seems we'll see this year. I'm hopeful that we're going to get big colonies that come back again. Or aggregations, excuse me, because they're not actually colonies. All right, so moving on from arthropods, some of the other big groups that are popular for people to study or to learn about with field trips at Quail Ridge, we have a lot of reptiles and amphibians. Reptiles and amphibians, we have over 100 species in the state, and 20 of those species are documented at Quail Ridge. We have a lot of lizards and snakes, and also in the amphibian world, we have over here on the left, this is a western toad I actually just found a couple weeks ago on the reserve. But we have Pacific chorus frogs, which some of you might also know as Pacific tree frogs. Those use our seasonal ponds as breeding territories. We have California newts also use the ponds as places to breed and lay their eggs. So the ponds right now are full of little newt and frog eggs that hopefully will hatch out and successfully grow and metamorphose before the ponds dry up. And then we also have, for example, our classic here, an alligator lizard in the center. Alligator lizards are sort of a classic woodland lizard here in the state. And then in the lower right, this is just a couple weeks ago also, this is a baby California king snake that I found near one of our main buildings. So just a few of the highlights here, but this is one of the things that we have as an opportunity for classes. If some of you might be familiar with herpetology cover boards, they look like pieces of plywood or corrugated metal roofing. And if you put them out in the woodland and just leave them there, they become artificial habitat for amphibians and reptiles. So you can leave them as a place where you can go with a class and it's sort of a controlled environment where you can open it up and see if you can find any reptiles or amphibians to share with the class. It's a good way for field trips, and it's also just an easy access introduction to herpetology for newcomers. And for us, we're interested in it because we can monitor then the sort of biodiversity and abundance of these different reptile and amphibian creatures at the reserve. Excellent. And now keep moving on to another one of our groups, birds. Birds are always popular. In terms of research, they're not the top of the list right now at Quail Ridge, which is interesting. We get a lot of researchers oriented towards the plant communities and towards insects, though we do have some bird research happening too, including every year we're one of the sites for the annual Audubon Christmas bird count. So we have over 132 species documented at the reserve. Every year, the Christmas bird count documents in a single day in December around 50 species of birds. The reserve is a spine, a peninsula with a high elevation spine. It's about 1,400 feet at the highest point and 400 feet elevation at the shore of the lake. So we have a lot of relief and very steep topography, and that lends itself well to the many raptors and birds of prey that like to call the Intercoast Range home. We frequently see bald and golden eagles soaring in the thermals along with red-tailed hawks. Just lately, I've been watching a pair of golden eagles who look like they might be thinking about trying to make a nest. Where? No idea. But why else would you see a golden eagle carrying sticks around? Cooper's hawks are one of our most common. Those, you remember those refugia woodlands, those areas where the oak woodlands survived the fire? The Cooper's hawks really like those more woodland places where they can prey on small songbirds, squirrels, things like that, and they're well adapted to those woodland environments. So we have a lot of Cooper's hawks that sort of inhabit those thicker woods. Lately, in the spring and winter, we have a lot of kestrels who come and use the nice open hillsides as good hunting grounds for small mammals and insects. And white-tailed kites actually use the reserve. This is the second year in a row they've been using the reserve as a late winter, early spring location. Last year, and this was new to me, we actually saw white-tailed kites at the end of the summer congregating in groups of 15 to 30 on the reserve and roosting together. I wasn't aware of this, but apparently the kites like to do what is called neighborhooding before they migrate at the end of the summer. So cool fact, you always learn something new when you go to work. So a little bit of information about some of the things that we've noticed talking with some of our researchers who come out to do the Christmas bird count is that the bird community has changed since the 2020 LNU complex fire. That's at Quail Ridge and more generally within the Intercoast Range, since so much of the hills here west of Davis and Woodland burned in that fire. Not too unexpectedly, we've noticed that we have a lot of woodpeckers and a high diversity of them. A lot of the oaks did, in fact, get killed by the fire, but did not fall down. So there's a lot of good wood there that probably is growing lots of good insects now for all the woodpeckers to come and forage on. So that makes sense. We've also seen a lot of seed-eating birds. These are things like your sparrows and your other small songbirds that are more specialized on seeds. And that makes sense. They're probably following that great growth of all of those grasses and all the seeds they produce since the fire happened and removed all of that big scrubby chaparral. And finally, we've noticed that there seem to be fewer specialized birds that need that chaparral, that really dense, scrubby habitat to survive and succeed. And that makes sense because most of that chaparral, that chamise, is very full of oil and it burns pretty much completely to the ground when a wildfire happens. So we probably won't see a lot of those more chaparral specialized bird species for a while until that scrubby plant community starts to redevelop. Here, this photo is just a nice photo of a hairy woodpecker, one of the common ones we see down in one of our seasonal stream canyons, and is always pecking away on some piece of oak tree. All right, so here is a little video for you guys that I'll play in a moment. But to give you a preface, Quail Ridge Reserve has our classic state bird, the California quail, which I think most of us are familiar with. You remember, the males have a sort of a top knot, and the females a smaller one. Well, Quail Ridge has both those and has the mountain quail, which I imagine many of us have not seen as frequently. Mountain quail are similar, but they actually have more of a exclamation mark shaped feather on their head. And this is a video from one of our wildlife cameras at a spring on the reserve of a male who's leading his newly born chicks along to go get a drink of water. So here it is for your viewing pleasure. Perfect. So as you can see, he has a ton of babies at this point. I don't know how many of those babies made it to adulthood. Um, but you can see he's being a very vigilant dad. And that's one of the things that's pretty, not unique, but an interesting fact about quail is that the male birds, the fathers, are often quite protective of all of, and very good at sort of paternal care of all the baby quail. And here I was talking, if you remember, our we have two of our characters from the cast of characters of birds I mentioned a couple slides ago. This is a Cooper's hawk in one of those woodland habitats. And if you look closely, the light's not great, but it has another bird in its talons. All right, so right there we have that is a Cooper's hawk, and I'm pretty sure that was an acorn woodpecker in its talons. So acorn woodpeckers are also a really common oak woodland bird. You might have seen their granary trees where they have tons of little acorns stuck in them. Sometimes they like to use telephone poles. Um, but I showed up not an hour after this happened, and I'm pretty sure from looking at the feathers I found that it was an acorn woodpecker. All right, so, and now our final sort of natural history group is our mammals. We get a lot of our wildlife cameras have a picture something like this in them of gray squirrels. So we have lots of active gray squirrels on the reserve. We're confident of that. We also have deer mice and other mice, wood rats and voles. And then in our sort of omnivores and carnivores and our charismatic fauna, we have coyotes, gray fox, black bear, bobcat, and mountain lion have all been observed on our wildlife cameras. And a couple years ago, we actually had a mama mountain lion and her babies who were using their reserve as the sort of base of their operations. So a couple more videos for you, then I'll talk briefly about the research projects that we host through UC Davis and other places. And then we'll wrap up just with a couple discussions of some, hopefully, research happening at Quail Ridge moving forward. So here, this is going to just be a quick video of a fox with what I'm pretty sure is a quail in its mouth. This is sort of a classic, we don't always see them with food, but the foxes really love late night wandering around the reserve. And they're fast. And then here, first of all, a warning, if you are concerned or feeling worried about mountain lions due to the recent event in El Dorado County, maybe don't plan to watch the next video. But for me, as a wildlife lover, it's very cool. And for me, it's always about the respect that there are wild animals out in the wildlands of the world. And here's my lucky chance to see one. Cool. So that right there is a mountain lion who came to a little water source that we had the camera at. So for me, at least, just so cool to get to know that all of these creatures that I might not see on a day-to-day basis are here at Quail Ridge, and we're having a good home for them, and we have a vibrant, healthy ecological community, even after this devastating wildfire. So with that in mind, we mostly serve as a research site, right? So we have had a lot of projects since the fire happened that somehow have used the fire as an opportunity to study something they couldn't have otherwise. So one of the things, Quail Ridge falls at this moisture zone that it gets enough coastal influence from Napa Valley that it has a really high diversity of lichens, but it also has chaparral, which is sort of a specialized habitat for lichens. So we've had a big study looking at lichens and their diversity across the reserve, especially since the fire and how well they've survived the fire. We've had a couple of different projects looking at how the fire affected vegetation and either the restoration and recovery of plant communities or the diversity of insects and soils, depending on how hot it burned. And then even how pathogens that are carried by ticks, which are common here in the Coast Range, how those pathogens become more or less prevalent with the fire. Ongoing studies that were previous to and have continued since the fire include long-term mouse and wood rat behavior, the viruses that are present for plant viruses mostly in soils across California. So we serve sort of as a site in a broader network for that study. A lot of studies happen that look at the phenology, so the timing of when different insects emerge, their abundance and diversity of native bees and wasps are in the Coast Range. The trapdoor spider project I mentioned, so that's looking at the diversity of trapdoor spiders and their life history. Tuleyome, and then more things related to tick pathogens, and then a new study last year looking at how the microbiome, the microbes that live on the roots of blue oaks, either did or did not survive the wildfire. Then here's a quick list of some new projects. Similarly, this is we have everything from microbes to bat communities to looking at how climate change might affect oak seedlings and how the Pacific chorus frog, what a lot of us think of as the Pacific tree frog, how the timing of when they are out might affect how successful they are at reproducing. And here, this is just a view looking towards Monticello Dam from out on Quail Ridge. It's a beautiful place to get to work. And this is actually a photo about this time of year, a year or two ago. looking out through the burned landscape. So as you can see, it's growing back pretty darn well. And then one of the big things that I'm hopeful that we can do at Quail Ridge moving forward is that we can serve as part of a statewide sentinel site network. This would be kind of like a way to collect biodiversity and climate data across the state on University of California lands and mostly fish and wildlife properties, trying to keep a finger on the pulse of the biodiversity and climate in the state. And the way that we could serve to help with this, along with Stebbins Cold Canyon, is as a place to sort of try to take some of these technologies. Field biology is really labor intensive and expensive. So we're trying to see if we can have lower cost technologies like wildlife cameras and microphones and things that can help us keep our finger on the pulse of that biodiversity. And Quail Ridge would be one of the places where we could test some of these methods before we spend a ton of money to try to deploy a big system across the state. So map on the left, and then on the right here are photos from a wildlife camera, and the little squares around those animals are actually a computer that's trying to identify that animal to its species using sort of AI technology. And then finally, one of the cool projects that we had recently was we had a fire happen, and we'd like to know how the plant communities are going to recover. And here we're looking at the squares. This is part of Quail Ridge in Google Earth. So you can see it's a very steep and crenulated place. And these different squares are places where we had people go out on the ground and characterize how many of the trees died, what kind of vegetation it is, and how well it's growing back. But as I said, that's a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of labor. So one of the things we're piloting at Quail Ridge is seeing whether we can get a drone to take photos of those areas and teach the drone based on what the people who went on the ground and did the data they collected, teach the drone to effectively figure out if a tree is alive or dead in the aerial photos it takes. And hopefully this kind of thing could be applied across a lot of the state of California, where fires have recently torn through various woodlands. Our final little bit of what we do at Quail Ridge, we host a lot of field trips for various classes, not only from UC Davis, but from local junior colleges and from across a broad array of environmental science and other classes at UC Davis. It's a great learning opportunity for students. It's an outdoor classroom, and we're only 45 minutes from campus, so it's a really easy site to use. So one last little plug before we leave and open it up for questions. Quail Ridge, as I said, is a reserved for research, teaching, and outreach. So it's by permission only access. And it is a very similar ecosystem to Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve. So if you're excited about my talk and you'd like to get out into the Intercoast Range, I would recommend you go to Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve, which is just right next door to Quail Ridge, where you can just pull up, park. There's lots of signs and information, and you can go on a hike there. If you have more questions about the research that's happened at Quail Ridge or any other questions, feel free to contact me. My contact's on the next page that I'll show you. But do remember that we're not generally open to the public. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope I've given a brief overview of Quail Ridge and some amount of the research that happens at the reserve. And I'd love to answer any questions you might have.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Brennan, for a great talk with lots of awesome videos. And so if folks have questions, you can either raise your hand and unmute yourself and fire away, or you can put the question into the chat, and I would be happy to relay them. So we do already have a few questions in the chat, so I'll get started. So a question from Robin wondering about effects of climate change on oaks. She's heard some talk about, maybe we need to be moving species to make sure they're doing okay with climate change, and what do we know about the general outlook for our native oaks?
Great question, Robin. So the first answer is that that project is part of a graduate student's PhD project here at UC Davis. And I actually, the results are not in yet about whether the native oaks will adapt. That was sort of the question of the project, and I have not yet heard the final answer from the student. What I can say is that we know that the oaks like getting extra carbon dioxide. It helps make photosynthesis easier. However, they also need water, and as we know, drought is a thing in California and maybe becoming more severe off and on. So Quail Ridge, I think, serves two roles in that. On the one hand, will they adapt? I trust at least some of them will, but maybe not the big, beautiful adult oaks we see today. It may take a couple generations, and that may lead to a different looking oak savanna than what you and I think of today. But Quail Ridge also serves as, in the regional sense and in a broader sense, as part of what might be a repository of genetic diversity, and also land that oaks might be able to even naturally not migrate, but move latitudinally if they need to as climate shifts.
Great. And I'll add that's another really important aspect of the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument as a whole, because it has this really long north-south reach. So that's been pushed as one major benefit of protecting the area in general. All right, question from M. Davis in the chat. Are ringtails permanent residents, and how are they affected by the fire?
So the ringtails, that ringtail photo is actually from Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve. So I think they are confirmed at Quail Ridge, though in the year and a half I have been there, I have not seen any on our wildlife cameras. Though the one at Stebbins Cold Canyon was within the last year or so. And I don't know how they were affected by the fire. I think they're quite rare from what I gather in the area. So I would guess they fared like a lot of the mammals. They're around, and I actually don't know how their abundance has changed as a result.
Right. Following along with that, Darren asked, after the recent fires, have there been any surprises in the recovery of native species or changes in invasive species?
So an interesting thing that I've noticed is that oaks are not across the board, but many oaks are very vigorous stump sprouting plants, right? The above ground part may have been killed by the fire, but the stump will sprout new shoots in a year or two afterward. And what we found is that the interior live oaks in particular have been very enthusiastic in stump sprouting. The blue oaks, on the other hand, seem to rarely stump sprout. And the blue oaks, I know, they're sort of an iconic California tree, and there's some concern they're already being affected by climate change. And so that's a concern for me. I have seen a small amount of seedlings of blue oaks, but not as much as I might have hoped to by this time. But their mortality was variable. It varied a lot based on where they were on a slope, how much the adult oaks died or not. In terms of invasive plants, my guess is that a lot of those chaparral areas we had are gonna get invaded by Eurasian grasses just because there's so much open real estate now that's not covered with big shrubs. That might change. The chamise is recovering quite well, so it may ultimately outcompete those grasses, but that's going to be on a, you know, decade to 50-year time scale that we're going to see those changes. And otherwise, the patches of invasive things like star thistle or goat grass that are big deals in the intercoast range for invasive plants, they were already on the reserve, but they don't seem to have expanded too much as a result of the fire.
Great. So we had a question from earlier in the talk, the kind of slide about who owns what on the property. There was a note there saying that the BLM area wasn't under agreement, and they were wondering what that meant.
Oh no, it is under agreement.
Okay.
So everything within the border of the reserve is managed by under memorandums of understanding that UC Davis manages all the properties, including the Bureau of Land Management property and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and those are all closed to the public.
Gotcha. Then I had a question. You talked a little bit about I think they were called cover boards for the creating habitat for the
Yeah,
herps.
yeah.
Is that the right name for them? Cover board?
Yep, cover boards, yeah.
Uh, and could you talk just a little bit about how you construct those, what those look like?
Sure, yeah. No, they're literally a 4 foot by 4 foot sheet of plywood of whatever thickness you have around. Uh, that you go and you lay it out in whatever habitat you want. And we have them with, a 4 foot tall piece of PVC with something bright on the end so you can see it even in the grass. And you lay it there and you don't move it. And we also put a piece of corrugated metal roofing, maybe 2 feet by 4 feet, next to it as a different type of habitat. And then you have those as fixed places where you can go and you can check them every week or every month to see if there are any herps living under them. So they're sort of artificial habitat that they're the equivalent of, a log that you could roll over to look for a salamander, except that they're big in area and they're a square, so they're a little easier to deal with than a log.
Makes sense. Yeah, I'm thinking that would be a great thing to put in the Woodland Regional Park to use on my field trips with the kids.
Yeah, totally. No, that's one of the things they're used a lot by field trips as a way to learn about the biodiversity of herps and learn a new field method too.
Awesome. All right, another one from the chat. Jazz says Quail Ridge would serve as a great location to add to the statewide network of cameras to highlight climate and biodiversity state priorities like 30 by 30. How do you envision working with other organizations and stewards, in terms of contributing to things like 30 by 30 and you kind of statewide conservation priorities?
Yeah, great question. So this Sentinel site network idea comes out of the broader California Biodiversity Network, which is one of the round tables that falls under the 30 by 30 initiatives. And so this is very much still in the ideas stage. We would serve as a site, and right now we're trying to serve as part of figuring out some of those methods before they go to scale. As far as the question about the organizations and stewards playing a role in that monitoring and conservation strategies, I have two feelings about it. On the one hand, I manage what will hopefully be one of like 80 sites across the state. So I imagine that there'll be a lot of partners working in a lot of different parts of the state. And the other part of me is that I would love to think more about that, but I already have my hands full managing this one place with 2,500 acres. So I'm gonna try to help facilitate figuring out the methods before I think about scaling up.
All right, great. Any final questions for Dr. Brennan? All right. So thank you again for an excellent talk. So this Nature and You lecture series is a monthly lecture series that is supported by donations from viewers like you. So if you haven't done so already, we would love a small donation to keep the lecture series going. I put the link in the chat there. Our next lecture is coming up the fourth Thursday in April. That's going to be with Sarah Killingsworth from Project Coyote, who'll be talking about coyote biology and coyote interactions in urban settings with people. So be sure to check that out. And then also, come sign up for one of our wildflower tours. We've got a bunch coming up in the next month or so. It should be a lot of fun. All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Brennan, and everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your evening.